Hello, Mindy.
Hey, Daddy, how are you?
Okay.
Hey, hi, Sue.
Current monitor goes.
Okay. Um, well, I think we can begin. Last week we were talking about the Jews of Western Europe, and the impact of the 18th century Enlightenment and their integration and assimilation into the modern countries of Western Europe. But the other group of Jews were the Eastern European Jews, the Polish, Russian, Hungarian, Romanian Jews. And the Enlightenment never really got to Eastern Europe. You can actually argue that it hasn't gotten to Russia even yet. And so the Eastern European Jews had a very different fate. And it started really with the Polish Jews. When we talked about Poland, we mentioned that the Poles adopted that really weird system of government where anything Parliament passed had to be unanimous, so that every single aristocrat had a total veto on anything the country did, which led to a very, very weak central government. And it finally resulted with Poland's neighbors starting to take bites out of it. And Poland really was not able to defend itself. And the climax was in 1795, when Poland literally vanished from the map of Europe. It was partitioned between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Um, Prussia got some of the Baltic areas. Austria got southern Poland, which was Galicia, and most of it went to Russia. Russia got what is now Ukraine and most of the rest of Poland. And actually, Poland was not really put together again, didn't appear on a map of Europe again until after World War One, when it was put together again at the Paris Peace Conference. Um, so basically, overnight, 1 million Polish Jews became Russian Jews. And at the time this partition happened, the Tsarina of Russia was Catherine the Great. And Catherine the Great was a world-class anti-Semite. The way she saw the annexation of Poland, the good part was that she was getting a huge chunk of Central Europe. In Ukraine, she was getting some of the best agricultural land in the world and extending her empire to the west. The downside was that 1 million Jews came along with it. And her solution to the problem was to try to quarantine the Jews. she decided that all these Polish Jews could not move into Russia itself. They had to stay where they were. And what she created was what was called the Pale of Settlement. And this was a strip of land that ran across Europe, starting with the Baltic Sea in the north and running in a southeasterly direction down to the Black Sea in the south. Jews were not allowed to move out of that Pale of Settlement. They couldn't move to St. Petersburg or to Moscow or to anywhere within Russia itself. And so Catherine thought the best solution to what she thought was the Jewish problem was simply to quarantine them inside the Pale, keep them outside of Russia proper. Um, and Jewish life in Russia has always been pretty miserable, and really for a variety of factors. One is that Russia itself is a pretty miserable place with a really miserable history. If you think about it, who is your favorite comic Russian writer? What do you own that's made in Russia? It's always really been a country that this has never been very much fun to live in. Also, the Russian Orthodox Church, which dominated the culture in Russia in those years, was one of the most intolerant of any other religion, including the Jews. And on top of that, Russia, with a couple of exceptions, has really been badly governed. If you look at the various the various royal houses of Europe, whether it's the Windsors in England or the Bourbons in France, or all the or the Habsburgs in Austria, none of these people are Mensa candidates. But even by European royalty standards, the Romanovs were unusually stupid people. Russia has always been a badly misgoverned country. If you read any history of the Romanovs in Russia, it really makes you start feeling better about Lenin. You really feel somebody had to get rid of those people, sooner or later. And so, and things tended to go from bad to worse for the Jews in Russia. After Catherine, the throne went to Nicholas I in the early 19th century. And again, his solution to the Jewish problem was try to force assimilation. The Jews were made to give up their traditional dress, the long black coats and the black hats, that were typical of the Eastern European Orthodox Jews, were banned by him. There was a required length of beard. You couldn't have a beard beyond a certain length. Yeah. Luckily, you're not living in Russia. And they were made to take up Russian names. Many of as late as the 19th century, many of the Jews of Russia, still have the biblical way of naming themselves. They didn't have family names. You were David, son of Meir. You were Chaim, son of Isaac. This kind of thing. He forced them to take Russian names, and a lot of the names we immediately recognize as Jewish are really Russian names. They were taken during this time. And the instrument that he used more than anything else was the Russian army. He would draft Jewish boys into the Russian army as young, really, as 14 years old. And the term of service was 25 years. And the idea was away from their communities, away from their religion for 25 years, that they would lose all touch with Jewish culture. And it was a way to assimilate them into Russian life. And this caused a lot of problems in the Jewish communities because the way the system worked, every Jewish community had a certain quota of young boys that had to give up for the army. And the local leadership of the Jewish community was given the job of choosing who went. And you can imagine what kind of maneuvering went on. People wanted to save their kids. The wealthy who tried to bribe their way out of it. Anybody with influence anywhere. It caused a lot of tension between Jews within the Jewish community. Nicholas was followed by his son Alexander II in 1855. And for a really brief time, it looked like things were looking up. Alexander actually was a relatively liberal czar, or at least he had liberal advisors. He actually got around to freeing the Russian serfs in 1861, a couple of years before President Lincoln got around to doing it over here. So there was some real hope in Russia, that maybe Russia was finally, turning toward the West, was going to finally catch up with the rest of Europe and 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 was going to liberalize itself. He also took away a lot of Catherine's strictures on the Jews. Jews were allowed to leave the Pale of Settlement. They could live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. They could go to Russian universities. And it looked like, that things were finally looking up for Jews in Russia. But the problem was that in 1881, he was assassinated by a bunch of anarchists, several of whom were Jewish. And his brother took the throne as Alexander III. And he was convinced that his brother's assassination was really due to his liberal policies. That Russia could only could be governed only with an iron hand. As soon as you let up any and start liberalizing things, everything falls apart. And so he did a 180-degree turn. Um, there was a strong reaction. He was probably as anti-Semitic as any czar that Russia has ever had. And he and his main minister, a man named Pobedonostsev, came up with what they called the one-third solution. And the idea was that over the next few decades, one-third of the Russian Jews would convert, one-third would immigrate, and one-third would die. And that would be the solution to the Jewish problem. And one of the tools they used for that were the pogroms. And the pogroms usually took place in the spring around Holy Week. And this was in cooperation with the Russian Orthodox Church. The priests would usually preach sermons around this time, reminding their parishioners that the Jews killed Jesus. And here were Jesus's murderers, living among us and prospering. And we usually goad them into a frenzy where they went out looking for Jews to beat up or kill, or Jewish businesses to loot. The police worked together with the church. They knew when the pogrom was going to start, and they made a policy of not being around, when it happened. And these got worse and worse as the 19th century progressed. Um, in 1881, in May of 1881, a group of laws called the May Laws were passed, which essentially took away all the gains that the Jews had gotten under Alexander II. And this is what really triggered the beginning of the migration of Russian Jews to America. A few really idealistic ones, went to Palestine. The 1880s is when the modern Zionist movement started. And a few really idealistic young Jews, went to Palestine to form settlements there. A few of them ended up in Western Europe, but most Western European countries had a immigration quota. They would only take a small number. America was still wide open then, and this is really where most of the Jews fleeing the pogroms in Russia went. It was the beginning of the Great Migration that really formed most of the present Jewish community in America. Almost the great majority of Jews living in America today are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of people who left Russia sometime between 1880 and 1920, to come to the United States. There really was only one exception to that, which is really kind of a strange kind of thing. One of the projects that the government had was to build a Trans-Siberian Railroad, a railroad that would go across Siberia and link up Western Russia with Vladivostok, which was uh, Russia's port on the Pacific Ocean. And when they laid out the route for the railroad, it was obvious the most efficient, cheapest route for the railroad would have to go through Manchuria, through northern China. And so the Tsarist government cut a deal with the Imperial Chinese government. The Chinese would permit the railroad to run through Manchuria, which was their northern province, but they wanted some benefit from it. They wanted a major terminal built, in Manchuria, and they wanted branch lines built that would go down into China, so China would have some advantage from the railroad too. Um, it looked really promising. The only problem was nobody in their right mind wants to live in Manchuria. It's known for really horrible winters. It can go to 30 or 40 below in Manchuria. And no Russian wanted to settle there, to work there. And so one of the Tsar's ministers came up with a great idea, give it to the Jews. And so the deal that the Tsarist government made with the Jews was, if you'll go to Manchuria, set up the railroad thing there, found a city there, which can be used as a central point for the railroad, we'll leave you alone. In other words, no pogroms. The Orthodox Church won't bother you. We'll just forget you ever existed. You can have your own life out there in Manchuria, and all the stuff we're doing to the Jews in Russia, you can escape all that. And a lot of Jews bought into it. In 1896, the construction began on the railroad, and in 1898, the first Jews arrived. It was a little fishing village named Harbin, and the Jews built it into a city. In 1903, it was incorporated into a city. Uh, and basically, the initial settlers were Jews who were running away from the pogroms, in Western Russia. After the 1905 Russian-Japanese War, and many of the war veterans, who were fighting in Siberia with Japanese, decided to stay on and move to Harbin. And also, in World War One, a lot of people deserting from the army or fleeing from the fighting between the Germans and Russians on the Eastern Front ended up in Harbin. And then when the Bolshevik Revolution took over Russia, that was followed by a Russian Civil War. And a lot of refugees fleeing the Civil War also went east and ended up in Harbin. In the first couple of decades of the 20th century, the Jews turned Harbin into a major city. It's estimated at the peak there were about 20,000 Jews there. There were several synagogues, a number of Jewish schools. The Jews started banks, department stores. They actually made it into a functioning city. Um, but that only lasted till the 1930s. In 1931, World War II began in the Pacific with the Japanese invading Manchuria. The Japanese invaded Harbin, and there was a widespread massacre of the Jewish population there. It was really the beginning of the end uh, for uh, for Harbin. The ones that were left in 1945, when the Soviet army drove the remnants of Japanese out of Asia, the Soviets deported a lot of Jews to the Gulag. And then the final blow was in 1949 when Mao Zedong took over Manchuria. He drove out the remaining Jews. So that was really the end of the Jewish community in Harbin. The synagogue there actually now is a museum. There's actually one Jew left in Harbin today, and he's an Israeli who is simply there for the tourists. He's there to run the museum and the surviving synagogues and take tourists around. If you want to read the details of that, there's a really good book by Dara Horn, and it's called "People Love Dead Jews." And that's one of the chapters in her book. She really goes into depth into the Harbin experience. And actually, today, Harbin is one of the major cities in China. It's a city of about 16 million people, but no Jews. And it's the capital of China's northern provincial capital of China's northernmost province in Manchuria. But other than that, the history of the Russian Jews was really pretty dark, and it got progressively worse as the 20th century went on. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War began, and Russia was losing it. The Japanese destroyed the Russian army, the Russian Navy, in the Pacific. They invaded Siberia, and they were pushing the Russians back. Finally, our president, Teddy Roosevelt, actually won the Nobel Peace Prize by negotiating a negotiated peace between Japan and Russia. But it was a tremendous blow to the Russian psyche. There was this tiny island off the east coast of Russia, which most Russians had never even heard of, and it had beaten Russia in a war. It's almost like if the United States got into war with Cuba and Cuba was invading our East Coast and actually pushing, the American army back. So it was a tremendous shock to the Russian people. And naturally, they needed a scapegoat. And of course, the Jews were the obvious scapegoat. So after that, the pogroms got even worse. After the Russo-Japanese War, the migration became more intense. More Jews were leaving Russia. And that went on really until the First World War started. When the First World War started, it sort of pretty much put an end to travel across Europe. And then by the end of the war, the Bolsheviks had taken over in Russia. And but even though uh, many of the early Bolsheviks really were Jews. Jews actually were instrumental in the social revolution that overthrew the Tsar. Once Stalin took over by the mid 1920s, and again, Stalin was another typical Russian anti-Semite. By the mid 1930s, he had purged all the Jews out of the Communist Party. There were a number of big show trials in Russia during the 30s. All the original Russian Bolsheviks were eventually sent to Siberian labor camps or executed. Um, and the Jews really who still remained in Russia, who had not left before World War One, were essentially trapped there. After Stalin took over Russia in the mid 1920s, nobody left Russia for any reason at all. It was just a big outdoor prison, essentially. And so these Jews were trapped there all through the 20s, the 30s, and through the Second World War, even into the modern era. And the Soviets really tried very hard to suppress all Jewish religion and culture. And the one group actually in Russia who really did a really pretty gutsy thing were the Lubavitch Hasidim. They kept up setting up their Chabad houses, all over Russia. They ran a series of underground schools. Their rebbes were in and out of Soviet prisons, but they really are tough people. They really were. It was the Lubavitcher Hasidim who really dared to defy the regime and try to keep Jewish culture and religion alive, during the Stalin years. Um, and that really went on really up until the Soviet Union, finally fell apart in 1989. There were efforts, going back to the 1960s and 70s to try to get the Soviet Union to let the Jews go. You may remember the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that the United States government passed, which I think was in the late 60s, if I remember right. That was Scoop Jackson, who was a senator from Washington State at the time, and was a great friend of Israel. And he actually it was putting restrictions on trade with Russia if Russia kept refusing to let its Jews emigrate out of Russia. And so a few of them were able to get out. Um, Golda Meir actually paid a visit to Russia. I think it was in the early 1950s when she was foreign minister. And nobody really realized how many Jews were left in Russia at the time. But when she went to the synagogue in Moscow, what went in her visit there were literally tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of Jews filling the streets around the synagogue in Moscow, to see her. And finally, again, in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Jews were allowed to leave. And this was really the last major immigration wave going into Israel. Almost 1 million Russian Jews left Russia. That was pretty much all the ones that were left, and came to Israel. And even today, Israel has Russian language television stations, radio stations, Russian language newspapers. As a result of this huge Russian immigration, which is kind of poetic justice in a sense. The modern Zionist movement began in the late 19th century, mainly with Russian Jews, young Russian Jews coming to Palestine to begin the reclaiming of a land. And it's sort of the last wave of emigration closed with another wave of Russian Jews coming into Israel. Um, Anybody have any questions or any comments? Just unmute.
Um, wasn't there a kind of a big problem with the Russian Jews coming to Israel with integration? Um, I mean, just some of the things I've read, seems like we're still having some trouble with integration and with the Russian community in
Yeah,
Israel.
there was. No, you're right. There were a lot of complaints about them initially. That they tended to keep to themselves. That many of the older generation didn't want to start learning another language, and they didn't learn Hebrew. They kept speaking Russian. Although even the Israelis had to admit the one thing that Russia can do pretty well is educate people, especially in technical things. And, there was a joke going around Israel during those years. Anytime you saw a Russian Jew get off a plane, in Tel Aviv, and he wasn't carrying a violin case under his arm, then he was probably either a pianist or a physicist. And so one good thing that they did bring to Russia, a lot of these were really well-educated people. It took them a while to get integrated in, to learn Hebrew and to get integrated. Among many of them, they said that in the 90s, you could pull into a filling station, and the guy who was filling your car was a urologist. He just hadn't gotten his credentials, to practice in Israel yet. So it did take a while really to integrate them. One of the events though that was kind of a turning point, and that was after the Camp David summit fell apart in 2000, when Yasser Arafat walked away from it, and he started the Intifada. That's when you had suicide bombers blowing themselves up on buses and in buildings, all over Jerusalem. And there was one club the teenagers used to love it in Tel Aviv called the Dolphinarium. It was kind of a jazz club. And a suicide bomber blew himself up in there and killed about, I think, 30 or 40 young people who were there, most of whom were recent Russian immigrants. And there was an editorial in one of the major national newspapers the next day. He says, from now on, there's no questioning that these people are Israelis. Now, that was their baptism of fire into Israel. Nobody's going to criticize the Russian Jews anymore.
Daddy, do you want to talk about your family?
No, you can tell them.
So Fred, our
Yeah.
dad's grandmother, my great grandmother, was a Polyakov.
Mhm.
And the story we were all told was that her uncle was the railroad baron in Siberia for the Siberian
Mhm.
Railroad, Samuel Polyakov. And they were friends with the czars at the time, and he was wealthy, and he helped start the synagogue in St. Petersburg, and then other parts of his family started the synagogue in Moscow. And about 12 years ago, when I went to Russia to visit, I went to the Moscow synagogue, and there are Polyakos all over. And then the St. Petersburg synagogue, they actually interviewed me as a descendant of a Polyakov. And at some point he had to leave. He ran away to Russia. He ran away and went to France, and we don't know what happened. But did I tell it right, Dad?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. As far as anyone knows, there's no significant Jewish community left in Russia today. The only people actually, though, who are still there, so there must be a few Jews, again, are these Lubavitcher Hasidim.
Yes,
They're still there. Yeah.
Right. The synagogue in St. Petersburg, the woman that interviewed me was Lubavitcher. They were very Orthodox. They wouldn't even shake Lewis's hand. She had the wit. And she said they actually do have a day school now. It's still a beautiful
Yeah.
synagogue. And they do have a day school, and it's
Yeah.
probably gotten a lot worse since I left. So,
Yeah, one thing you really have to say, I mean, there's a lot of things I don't like about the Hasidim. But one thing you've got to say about the Lubavitchers, most of the rebuilding that's gone on in Europe after the Holocaust, when almost all the Jewish institutions across Europe really pretty much destroyed, most of the rebuilding has really been the Lubavitcher Hasidim. They're willing to go anywhere. And they're the ones who are rebuilding synagogues, who are starting schools, who are trying to revive Jewish life again all over. Our Rebbe here in Greenville, the Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Kesselman, he has a brother who's running a Chabad house in Malmo in Sweden. And Malmo is a really bad place for Jews because it's an industrial town, and it's full of recent Middle Eastern, Syrian, and Iraqi immigrants. And there have been a number of violent incidents. His brother has been beaten up twice already on the street, and he won't leave. He's still going to stay there with his Chabad house. So you really have to respect these people.
Wow.
Okay. Um, Anybody have any other questions or comments? Uh, Um, yeah, if you look at the European picture in general, you know, the hope was, of most of the Jews, at least the Western European Jews, the ones of France, Germany, the Netherlands, England, was, that now that they've been liberated from the ghetto, now that they were assimilating themselves into a modern European life, anti-Semitism would fade out. It was a remnant of the medieval ghetto. And once, people got to know Jews and worked with them and, socialized with them, um, there would be an end to anti-Semitism. That was a very strong belief, all through the 19th century. And again, it never happened. One of the I think we talked about as we talked about the state of Israel. One of the things that inspired Theodore Herzl, to devote his life to a Jewish state, is when he was a correspondent for the Viennese news press in Paris, and he was there in the 1890s when see what was the case of I'm having a senior moment here. Hang on for a second. Um, he was the Dreyfus case, and Albert Dreyfus was a captain of the French army. He was falsely accused of espionage and passing secrets to the Germans. And what really upset Herzl, he thought not that whether Dreyfus was guilty or not. He actually thought that Dreyfus was guilty. But before he was sent off the desert to Devil's Island, for his prison term, there was a ceremony at the military academy in Paris, and, that where he was stripped of his rank, he was stripped of all his decorations before he was sent off to prison. And while this ceremony was going on, there were mobs running through the streets of Paris, chanting "Death to the Jews." And Herzl, it occurred to Herzl that if in France, the most liberal country in Europe, 100 years after the French Revolution, there was still that much latent anti-Semitism that could be brought to the surface that easily, then there was really no future for the Jews in Europe. He really believed at that point that anti-Semitism was just an indelible part of European culture and would never go away. No amount of progress was going to make any difference. The Jews had no future at all in Europe, and they had to get out of there as quickly as they could. He really, I think, may have been one of those rare people who actually had a premonition of the Holocaust. I mean, he made it his life's work to try to get Jews to leave Europe. And he didn't really even care initially where they went. He didn't really care whether it was even going to be in Palestine. He was willing to take Uganda when the British offered that, or even Argentina. He just believed that anti-Semitism will never vanish from European culture, and the Jews have no future in Europe. And the jury is still out whether he's right or not, even in modern Europe today. There's been a migration of a lot of French Jews, to Israel, given the rising amount of anti-Semitism, going on in France. So that even in the so-called enlightened, progressive, liberal European nations, it's still there. And Herzl may have been right. It may just be an indelible part of Western culture that will never be eradicated. Okay. Um, I guess we ought to decide now where we go next, with the class. If you follow the outline, that we're using here, the next section would be talking about Zionism and the modern state of Israel. Now, as you know, we have covered that before. We took that section out of context and we talked about that for a couple of sessions. Although I think it wouldn't hurt to go over it again. So we could really fork off in two directions at this point. We could go ahead next week and start talking about Zionism and the modern state of Israel, or we could skip that for those who have heard it before and go on to discussing the Jews in America. We can go either way. I think some of the people that have just joined the class in the last few weeks probably have not had the section on Zionism, and that's why I think it might be worth going over that again.
I don't mind hearing it again. I would love to hear it again if everybody wants to do that.
Okay.
Let's do it again.
Um, okay, let's go ahead and plan to do that then next week. We'll
And-
start, it's on page 18 on of the outline. And again, there are two books that I put on the reading list for that. If you look on the reading list, one is number 10. It's just called Israel. It's a small paperback, by Noah Tishby. It's very light reading. It's not really an academic book at all. Noah Tishby is an Israeli who lives in Los Angeles now. She's a movie director and actress. And she's written a very personal memoir, about her family in Israel and what modern Israel is like. And it's really, you can read it in one sitting almost. It's really easy reading. I think it's a great introductory book. The other book, which is number 9, I think to me is the best book I've ever read on the history of Israel. And it's probably the only one that was written by an Irish Catholic, Connor Cruz O'Brien. And the story of how that book came to be written is really interesting. Connor Cruz O'Brien was actually a novelist and poet in Ireland. Um, he was editor of the Saturday Review of Literature for a number of years, but his other interest was in Irish politics. He was active in Irish politics, and so in the early 1950s, he was appointed Ireland's ambassador to the United Nations. And in the preface of the book, he describes how he arrived in New York, for the first session of the United Nations, and there was a round of dinners and receptions to greet the new delegates. He said, he got a real polite reception from everybody, but he got an especially warm welcome from two groups, and that was the Iraqis and the Israelis. And he really didn't understand why until he went to his first session of the General Assembly. And then he realized that in the General Assembly, the nations sit in alphabetical order. And so Ireland sits between Iraq and Israel. And both the Iraqis and the Israelis were just so grateful to Ireland just for existing. So they didn't have to sit next to each other. And he said when he initially started out going to sessions, he tried to cultivate friendships on both sides with the Iraqis and the Israelis. But then in 1957, the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's party, overthrew the Iraqi monarchy and put in a new regime in Iraq. And the new delegate they sent to the UN had orders not to talk to anybody. And so he couldn't talk to the Iraqi delegate, and he spent all his time talking to the Israelis. And this is what really kindled his interest in Israel. And this book is really a result. And in a sense, it's a book from an outsider, from a non-Jew who doesn't really have any agenda, about Israel. And I think it's really what makes it worth reading. It's really as objective a history as you're going to find of Israel from somebody who really doesn't have an agenda. And also, since he's a novelist, he really writes well. The book is really good reading. Right?
What is his name?
What?
What was his name?
Connor Cruz O'Brien. Yes.
Connor Cruz.
Yep, his book's going to be a little hard to find. I think we got it on
Yeah.
one of the used book sites for a good price.
Yeah.
Not
For
sure
some
about
reason,
that.
it's out of print. I don't know why. It really,
Yeah.
to me, it's a great book. But you usually have to find it. I think you can get it on Amazon, get used copies of it. But it's really well. I think I think it's the best book I've ever read on the history of Israel in its early years.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. It's an easy read. It's a good read. Lots of information.
Yeah. So I think maybe we'll adjourn a little bit early tonight, and then we'll start in next week on we'll start in with the history of Israel.
Sounds good. Thanks, Fred.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay. See
Fred.
you guys next week.